Hey guys, I'm Naguura, and today I'm going to show you a portion of my stream where I was discussing the difficulty difference between Final Fantasy Savage raids and World of Warcraft Mythic raids, because so many people have been asking me to tell you about the differences in difficulty and also just how everything works. So I'm gonna go into a little bit of detail and the difference of those two games and the most difficult raids. And I'm also gonna just give you some examples of why it's so hard to compare those two. Definitely answer in the comments below what do you think about that, and if you agree with some points that I'm making. If you disagree, definitely let me know. And remember to give the video a thumbs up if you liked it and subscribe to my channel. And now go ahead and enjoy the video, guys. Okay, listen, like, I see that people are comparing the fight style from WoW to Final Fantasy. There's a very clear difference in my mind between like one of these like Savage fights compared to like a WoW style fight. And obviously, like, they're different games, so it makes sense that they're different, right? Because all the way your characters, for everything is different. You couldn't even have a fight work like WoW in Final Fantasy or the other way around. Actually, funnily enough, a fight, like a Final Fantasy fight, would be really easy in WoW. You know why? Because in WoW, everyone has so much mobility and so much utility. Stuff like this probably wouldn't be that hard. But in Final Fantasy, it is hard because you don't have like a billion movement skills, right? So obviously, like, it just doesn't cross over. Like, you can't just say, oh, this fight is so much harder than the other, because it doesn't really work that way, because the everything is different, right? Like, you have different tools to work with in both of the games. But yeah, it's clear that the Final Fantasy fights are a lot more like scripted, which doesn't necessarily mean it's like easier, because the script, I mean, think about like Painsmith, for example. Painsmith is also a scripted fight, but it's really hard, right? It's really scripted, but there's still some RNG factors of like who gets the debuff that needs to run out, where's the wall coming from, blah, 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 right? So that's kind of like this fight that we were just doing is the same. It is very scripted in like, it's doing this ability, then this ability, then this ability. But sometimes it's like, which way is the hand coming from? Like, is it right or left? Does it knock you from the right or left? Then you also have to, like, who gets the debuffs is random as well, right? Sometimes the damage dealer gets the flare, sometimes the other damage dealer gets the flare, and then it just changes up the way you do the fight a little. Not in like a super drastic way, but it still changes up the fight a little. And it's very similar to how a fight like Painsmith works, right? Like the same scripted way. It's scripted, but everyone has to do the mechanic properly. In WoW, you have some free time between mechanics depending on roles. No, that's like a way too generalized statement to make. You're basically saying that in Final Fantasy you have to play everything correctly, and in WoW you don't, which is obviously just not true. If you play the difficult content of both of the games, then you will have to play correctly in both games, right? It's clear. If you play like a Savage or Ultimate fight when it comes out with like the new gear and whatever, then you won't be able to make mistakes. Even in Final Fantasy, WoW players always say, oh, you can just infinitely rest people. It's so blah, you know? But obviously, you get like a really long debuff that gives you a damage, like you do less damage for like a minute, and then you won't make the damage check, for example, right? So no, you can't just like randomly die in like a Final Fantasy fight. That's just not how it works. And same as in WoW. Like in WoW, you also can't just randomly have people play mechanics wrong. Yes, you do have like in WoW, the way battle rests work is that you have a certain amount of rests that accumulate over time. So if you didn't have to rest somebody for like X amount of minutes, then you will be able to rest 2 or 3 people at almost no cost. Like, there's not going to be a debuff to the person that does less damage or something. But you only have very little. Like, if more than one person dies at the start, you won't be able to get the second person back up, right? You can only rest one at the start, for example. But yeah, you still, like, saying that you don't have to play the mechanics correctly is kind of like, that's obviously not true. Yeah, exactly, Helgon. That is the difference between a scripted fight and a not scripted fight in my mind. Like, just because something is scripted doesn't mean it's easy. Because when I say I guess it could be it could be easy if, so let's say you have a script of abilities and there's no RNG elements to it. Of course, that would be easier until you figure out the way you do it, right? That would be like, okay, does this ability first, then it does this ability, that, like in a like, you know, always like the same, and there's no RNG whatsoever. You know, like there's no RNG which people get the debuffs, there's no RNG where it comes from, blah, blah, blah. Like if that's how it works, then yes, that would be like, I guess you could consider that like easier than if there's no RNG elements whatsoever. Because then at some point you will just have the choreography like memorized, and then you're going to be able to do it, right? But at the same time, there's scripted fights that have RNG, and that makes it, you know, like even though you know which ability is going to happen, it still changes the way you have to play it depending on the RNG that is involved with like the debuffs. For example, the fight that we're doing right now. The fight we're doing is really scripted, but the people who get debuffs are different, and the sides that you have to move to, depending on where the hand is different. And then you also have the difference between like either it's like the slicer or like the line. And that changes the way you play the fight, right? That means you're not always going to be like perfectly doing the same thing. At least we are not doing that. I'm not sure if there's a strategy that lets you do that. I guess that is possible that exists. But the way we play the fight is that we don't do that, right? So you always have to change up the way you play a little. Then it just becomes more difficult because of it. Same with Paintsmith, right? The way Paintsmith works in WoW, it's like a scripted fight with some elements of RNG on who gets the debuffs. Does that mean Paintsmith is an easy boss? No, right? Paintsmith is a really difficult boss in WoW, and it's still a scripted boss. Like it doesn't deviate from the script of mechanics. It always is the same thing in the same order every time. The only difference is who gets the debuffs and where's the wall coming from, right? But then there's other bosses that are not scripted. And I'm not completely sure if Final Fantasy has any of those fights. I don't think so. But there are fights in WoW where a lot of mechanics, the way it works is that the boss has like an inner cooldown for mechanics. So basically, let's say the boss has like 5 main mechanics. Like that's the main abilities the boss casts. And then each ability has like an inner cooldown. So like one ability has a 30-second cooldown, one ability 10 seconds, one ability 20 seconds, and so on. And then the way those bosses work is that sometimes multiple abilities get ready at the same time. And then the boss RNGs whichever he casts next. So that creates boss fights that are not scripted. In that scenario, there's multiple different ways of what could happen next, right? And that's how some fights work in WoW. They don't all work like that. But some fights are like that, where you have like a little bit of an RNG involved on which ability happens next. Like you're not sure what happens next, you know? It might be like the tank ability, or it might be like, you know, some other ability. And, you know, like I don't know what's better or worse. They're just different, and I don't think necessarily that having RNG fights is like good, because sometimes it gets really imbalanced. Like for example, in WoW we have some RNG fights where depending on which order happens, the fight is either a lot easier or a lot harder, depending on which ability happens next. Because sometimes you get like a really bad combination of abilities that are really difficult to deal with, and then the next time you get a really easy one, right? And that is also not like, that doesn't feel so great, because if you get really unlucky and you get like the worst combo every time, then that's so much harder to deal with compared to like another tribe where you get the easy combo every time, right? So that's why sometimes that doesn't feel that great either. Of course, you have to deal with the difficult combo as well, because it can always happen, but yeah. WoW also has bosses that you can RNG roll an unplayable sequence of abilities if you push face at an unlucky time. Okay, I don't want to say that it's an unlucky time, because you can control when you push. Yeah, so that's like, there's bosses that are percentage based. So if you push them over a certain percentage, the face changes, right? which I think in Final Fantasy almost everything is time-based, right? And in WoW, there's a bunch of things that are percentage-based. And what happens sometimes is that a boss, when he changes the phase, he will also like reset the timers, the like inner cooldown timers that I talked about earlier. And then it creates an issue that if you push the boss right before an ability, and then the timer's reset, and then he pushes the same ability again, then all of a sudden you have like a really bad overlap of abilities, and you don't want that, right? And that creates some bad fights, in my opinion. Like I guess it's like personal preference. I personally am not a fan of it, but I mean, some people might see it as like a good thing, because the way that works then is that you need to make sure you have enough damage in each phase, but you can also not have too much damage as well. So sometimes you will have to, like, for example, let's say you pull a boss and you cannot push this boss to like 80% faster than like 30 seconds. And let's say if everyone uses their cooldowns on pull, then that will happen. So what you have to do then is you have to take away some cooldowns and delay them for after the 30 seconds, which for some people that's like a cool thing, because they think, oh, it's like strategy based, right? You have to like adapt and figure out where to use your cooldowns, which some people like that, right? Some people say, oh, it's nice that you have to think about where to use your DPS and when to stop DPS and where to like use your cooldowns and blah blah blah. And I personally somewhat agree that I think it's nice to actually having to change your cooldown usage according to the fight. I do think that's like a nice thing, but at the same time, I don't like it if you have to damage stop on a boss fight, and I don't think anyone likes that. I don't think anyone likes like when everyone has to stop damage, because otherwise you're gonna make the boss harder when you push it, right? Like that's just like an awkward feeling. Then like everyone's just standing around doing nothing, just waiting because, you know, oh, if you do too much damage, you're gonna make the boss harder, and that's just like, ugh. That just feels really bad. So I do hope, like, that's a thing that we have in WoW lately a lot, and people, like, obviously don't like that. I mean, I know that in Final Fantasy sometimes you have to adjust your cooldowns a little, but it's not this, like, the way it works in Final Fantasy is that the cooldowns aren't as impactful usually. Like, I don't want to... It's basically like some classes in WoW do like an insane amount of damage in their cooldown window, and then the rest of their like until they have the cooldowns again, they're gonna do very little damage, right? And it's not just like a minute as well. It's like, you know, like really long cooldowns. Like Moonkin, for example, 3-minute cooldowns. Like you do like a huge portion of damage for like 30 seconds, and then for 2.5 minutes you're like AFK, you know? And I don't think in Final Fantasy there is classes that have that. And don't get me wrong, I don't think that's good. Like I don't actually think that's a good thing. I don't like that. I don't like the fact that that's a thing. Ninja's kind of like that. Are you sure about this? Like, are you just mentor chatting now? I mean, I'm gonna show you, okay? Let me just show you this. You see this graph? This top one? That's his damage. Like, he's doing 64k DPS. And then he goes down to 4k, 5k. For like 2.5 minutes. He does 4k DPS. And then he goes back up to like 56k, 58k DPS. And then he goes down again. Like, that's what it looks like. Okay, this is like an extreme example because that's just a Moonkin. And that's how they work at the moment. And also the damage graphs, I feel like, because I've looked at some of the damage graphs. And usually they're not that, like, this is like very, like, I'm not sure, I mean, obviously I don't know exactly if we're playing like stuff wrong or not. But, like, usually if you look at the damage graphs, They are very like, of course there's like ups and downs, but it doesn't look super crazy. And they seem to be more frequent as well. Well, when you look at WoW, it's like huge bursts like during like Bloodlust, which is like a huge rate cooldown, right? And then it's pretty like steady, like much worse than the beginning, you know? It's like huge dam, and then it's just like a lot worse for a long time. And then some people get cooldowns back up, you can see here. But yeah, it looks like in like it's definitely like a lot more consistent. Well, I wouldn't really call it consistent, but like there's more frequent like damage windows, I guess. And the damage windows are not like super far apart. Yeah, I've been asking for steadier DPS in WoW all the time. I personally don't like burst cooldowns that much. The only reason... Okay, so a lot of people in WoW love burst cooldowns. But that's just because they want to look at big numbers. He's like, oh, big number, big DPS, woo. You know? And then they don't care about the rest. A lot of people just see the big numbers and like, oh, wow, I'm doing big damn, nice. But I'm pretty sure the game... Like, a game is more balanced and probably also feels better if your whole rotation matters, you know? I personally love that a lot more when I have more frequent windows where I do a lot of damage, because the way it feels like is that all of my damage windows matter, you know what I mean? Like, if you have these kind of smaller damage windows, then it feels like whatever you do throughout the fight matters and affects your damage, you know? The way it feels like in WoW, especially if you play Moonkin, I don't want to say that it's the same for all classes, because the way classes work in WoW is very different, right? So this is not going to be for every single class. But for Moonkin, for like this class, it feels like, okay, so whatever I do during my damage windows is incredibly important. If I press one button wrong, then I'm going to do a lot less damage. That's what it feels like, right? For like 30 seconds. And then for like 2.5 minutes, it feels like, oh, well, if I press this button wrong or this button wrong, it doesn't matter, you know? It's like I'm doing 4k DPS if I play perfectly. And if I don't play perfectly, well, then I might just do like 3.6k or 3k, you know? Like, it's not going to be a huge damage loss if I press a button wrong during this downtime, because I do so little damage, right? So it doesn't matter, you know? And I feel like that is like a bad feeling if you feel like whatever you do doesn't matter as much outside of your windows, right? Well, the way this works, like with a graph like this, it feels like no matter, like all of the time, it matters what you press, right?